Almost all cars cause conflicting feelings. What excites some, infuriates others. And, by the way, from adoration to hatred is often just one step. And some brands and models do not evoke any feelings at all, and it's not easy to remember them. But the Porsche Cayenne has absorbed the whole range of emotions, from delight to rejection, with the central point of balance at the point, complete indifference. They say, I will definitely never be able to afford such a thing. However, time passes, and even a Range Rover or Mercedes-Benz G-Class can be found no more expensive than new Korean cars, and on the go and not too rusty. So the Cayenne for someone can become a dream come true in 20 years or so. And what? The first generation just came out. Did you know that the Porsche Cayenne is a converted Volkswagen Touareg? You just don't tell the owner of a Porsche. However, the fact remains. With the exception of a number of details, the essence of these models is the same. But how different ideas and characters. The devil is definitely in the details. Although the suspension setup and interior entourage are not such trifles. With the advent of the second-generation Cayenne, the difference has become more noticeable, but again at the level of units and unit settings. Significantly, the list of problems of the popular VW Touareg is partly inherited by its conceited cousin. Partially, but not entirely, as in the case of differences, and the owners became the reason here, and not the struggle of unification with uniqueness. Those who bought the Cayenne are well aware that they took a Porsche, uncompromising, dynamic, always the first. Yeah, here are just the developers who, gritting their teeth, tried to teach the 2.5-ton Colossus to at least somewhat resemble the Carrera on the pavement and at the same time surpass at least the Tucson on the roads, were forced to squeeze almost all the juice out of the Volkswagen platform. So it turned out the bottom line is that the Cayenne always has a place for a feat and a breakdown. The first generation differs in this to a greater extent, the second, to a lesser extent. This is both good and bad. It's bad, because it can break for you too. It's good that it's easier to identify a breakdown, and not a floating fault. So it's easier to fix. Therefore, buying a used Cayenne is a good idea. Despite the fact that this is just a Touareg for the rich. And everything that is expensive requires a particularly thorough check before buying. The problems most often faced by owners of a Porsche Cayenne with a mileage of 150,000 kilometers can be roughly divided into 5 points. In the first place, the horror and awe of the first-generation cars, cylinders scuffing on V8 engines. If you carefully read the ads on the Russian internet, you can come across the phrase, the engine was replaced under warranty or something similar. At the same time, in Europe or in the USA, where half of the used SUVs came from, there are very few such announcements. This only applies to large V8 engines with a 90-degree camber and a short piston skirt. Since Porsche is not taken for a measured ride, and it's somehow not customary for us to monitor the oil every 1,000 kilometers, then some Porsches get into the sleeve of the blocks, or even to replace the motor. This pleasure, equal to overhaul, costs at least 250,000 rubles, engine replacement, 500,000. After the release of the second generation and changing the power range to a more modern one, cases of scuffing have become isolated, although they appear more often than in other cars of the concerned VAG. Nevertheless, not only timely oil changes, but also careful adherence to the full maintenance regulations are mandatory for the Cayenne. The next misfortune that overtakes the Cayenne in winter is the air suspension. It has become significantly more reliable than in the first years of the model's release, and no longer frightens with the possibility of dropping to 160 millimeters of ground clearance for no apparent reason due to a sensor that has lost contact, but it has not become problem-free either. The contacts and mechanism of the lever position sensors are still vulnerable. Sometimes the seals start leaking air. More often, as I have already noticed, this happens in winter, especially when there is a thaw during the day and a severe frost at night. At the same time, the Cayenne, like the Touareg, can suddenly sit down on one wheel, and after half a day run as if nothing had happened. The air suspension will cost about 50,000 rubles. For the original, it is better not to take others and not to deal with used ones. The failure of the transmission valve body is a thing of the past with 6-speed gearboxes. The new 8-speed sins with electronics failures and errors. In general, Cayenne after restyling has become even more of a computer on wheels, although its dimensions have decreased. Every year, automotive microprocessor electronics become more reliable, but also more complex. What people buy Porsches for leads to new consumables. In this case, I'm talking about hurricane dynamics and brakes. In Cayenne, not only pads, but also discs are subject to periodic replacement, and the frequency of change can be very surprising. Pads and discs are expensive, as, indeed, all spare parts for this SUV. Front and rear pads, from 9,000 rubles per set. Original discs, from 9,200 and 6,900 rubles, respectively. After 2012, a very high-torque and economical 4.2-liter diesel engine was installed on the Cayenne. With him, the car showed the dynamics of a turbocharged and efficiency version 3.6 V6. However, it should be remembered that on the V8 4.2 TDI there may be problems with the intake manifolds. With a run of more than 100,000 kilometers, oil seals leak and oil is squeezed out through the dipstick. In the open position, the EGR valves are wedged, which leads to the combination of the EGR channels for crankcase ventilation and the breakthrough of exhaust gases into the crankcase with all the unpleasant consequences. In turn, 3.0-liter diesel engines, with which the Cayenne is almost more in the secondary market than with gasoline engines, were marked by such a strange malfunction as a starter failure due to loss of contact with the ground. Eliminated in a second, but the sediment remains for a long time. Incredibly, the Porsche Cayenne is exactly the case when it is better to take it from America than from Europe, and even more so from the CIS. Do you remember this union? This applies exclusively to gasoline cars, of course. The reason is simple. The United States has very strict but reasonable environmental regulations, and fuel standards almost exactly match ours. Therefore, Cayenne, intended for the New World market, live happily ever after with us. Well, the everyday reason is that although Americans love fast driving no less than Russians, but, being somewhat more practical, they rarely reach the brink of reason and cherish expensive equipment. Differences of overseas versions from domestic ones are in other lighting fixtures and some details of the exterior finish. Air conditioners and engine cooling systems can be set to tropical mode. Drowned, if we are talking about the second generation, are not so relevant, but Carfax needs to be checked, and the probability of getting into a car restored after an accident is very high. In any case, even in the case of such an expensive, prestigious, and solid car of a famous brand, emotions should be driven to a certain limit. Check and recheck is the motto of those who buy a used Cayenne. Otherwise, this Porsche will return you to the sinful earth very quickly and painfully for the wallet.